Well, greetings, you curious Herle Burly-ites. I want to start by saying I have some major gratitude to express here. Your comments on Apple Podcast ratings and reviews have warmed my Hopkins cheesy encrusted heart these past few days. The following is just a sample. Abolish the CBC and replace it with the Herle Burly, writes Blair Buetall. Sean in Vancouver chimes in with, the episodes with Premier Fury and Messrs. Meigs and McDonald took things to a whole new level. The quality of the discussion, the insights, and the candor that David got from his guests was off the charts. I was hanging on every word. And finally, Nicole Family writes, a skilled interviewer with a genuine affection and respect for Canada and for those who make this country a better place, an opportunity to remind yourself of what interesting and accomplished people we are and why our country is and should be the envy of so many nations. I thank you for this generous outpouring of affection, and I encourage anyone who wants to dive headlong into the industrial podplex that is Apple ratings and reviews to go ahead and comment. Good, bad, and constructive. We're always looking for ways to improve the show. Although, hard to do better than our guest today. David Dodge is with me. Economist, former governor of the Bank of Canada. Mr. Dodge's career has been marked by high accomplishment in academia and the public service. I'm going to have to dramatically précis this or we'll be here the whole hour. PhD in economics from Princeton, assistant professor at Queen's, associate professor John Hopkins, senior fellow UBC, visiting professor Simon Fraser. As a public servant, senior positions on the Anti-Inflation Board, the Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation, G7 deputy, deputy minister of finance, deputy minister of health, and finally central bank governor. Today, as you might expect, we'll cover the big timely stuff. Inflation, the fiscal situation, the state of our economy, healthcare, the state of our public service, maybe some immigration. David, I'm really happy you're with us today. I mean, the reality is that, you, DM of Health and Finance, Governor of the Bank of Canada, turned down the clerkship of the Privy Council. You are the most accomplished. You're the greatest public servant of the last 30 years. I was thrilled to work with you, and I'm really thrilled that you're here to talk to us today.
Well, I don't know about that great public service, but it was great fun working with you, David.
I'm grateful to have an hour with you. I can't believe I used to get hours of you every day in those endless CMOs.
We're both older now.
We're both older. I'm not sure we have the stamina for those meetings anymore. All right, let's start with what's got you in the news the past few days, which is the report that you and Robert Asselin authored on the federal government's financial situation. The bottom line is that you did not think that their deficit projections are prudent, to use a word that we used often back in the day. Tell me about the risks that you see to the federal balance sheet right now.
Well, let's start with the big risks that we face in policy going forward. We've got a big demographic risk. We're all getting older. We've got a climate change risk. We've got let me call it technological or a digitalization risk. And we've got a changing world order, which is threatening both our trade and security. And all of that, when you add it up, I think dramatically increases the chance that we're going to have higher inflation, lower productivity going forward, and that the stress on government finances, both federal and provincial, is going to be much greater than either the federal government or the provincial government seem to be taking into account.
Do you think the federal government knows that?
Well, the federal government is not a person. It's.
Do you think Michael Sabia knows that?
I think let me put it differently. I think all of us in our tummies understand that this is the world of the next 30 years is going to be quite different than the world of the last 30 years. And so we inherently understand that, but we really don't like to face up to it very much. Right. And we don't, and that's natural. And so in making our policies day by day or year by year, we kind of try to avoid facing up to it. And that's where I think I say I think the risks of having a problem are really quite high, and that we should be planning to have enough room to deal with these problems as they occur in the context of this, if you will, overall downside risk.
Right. So how much do you think the deficit could be off?
Well, I think it. So let's look at it slightly differently. I think the problem is that we have built up.
This is just like a CMO, by the way, David. You're telling me I've asked the wrong question.
The problem is that we built up quite a bit of debt during the COVID period, understandably. So our starting point today is much more fragile than it was when the current Liberal government came to office, for example. And so we've got less room to maneuver. And so we could that 50% or close to 50% debt that we peaked out at in 22, we're going to have a hell of a hard time getting that down. And we risk, and this is, I think, the key point, we risk being in the position that the Mulroney government was in, where interest rates climb. And so the amount that you have to set aside every year to service the debt you start with rises. And so the deficit rises year after year after year, not because you are spending more, your deficit other than what you're paying for interest. You can stabilize that, but the interest then just eats up and eats up. And so, you get to a position that we got to in 92, 93, 94, where the interest charges were simply eating 30% of our revenue. And no government can go on delivering 70 cents worth of services for $1 worth of taxes that they're trying to extort from the public.
Does it really still matter, David? I mean, there's been so much money spent everywhere in the last number of years. And the amounts that the federal government spends, I mean, to go back to the kinds of dollars we were throwing around in the 90s just seems staggering, what they spend on things. And, back in the 90s, the Clinton administration was trying to eliminate the U.S. deficit. That's not even a conversation in the United States anymore. So it just feels like the rules are all different than they were in 1995.
No, the rules in 95 were that what we had to do was really bear down, and we did, and it was painful. It was painful what we had to do in 95, and we sure don't want to go through that again. And so the main job, as I see it, is to avoid having that sort of facing that sort of problem again. So what was true, though, from the last 20 years and after 1996 is that we had interest rates that were relatively low, in fact, very low. And when interest rates are less than the rate of growth of your economy, then past that does not eat up more and more of your revenues every year. And so since 97, when rates finally came down, because we took all those dramatic actions to deal with the fiscal problem, rates came down and stayed down. We've had a period when, in fact, governments could run deficits without that compounding year after year. That period, I think, I would argue, and many economists would argue, has really come to an end for the four reasons that I just went through at the start. We've got an aging society, which means we're going to have a smaller fraction of our population that is actually engaged in the labor force. We have to deal with climate change, which is going to slow down economic growth certainly for a period of the next 20 years. We've got to deal with digitalization, which means a huge restructuring, both of our industrial economy and our labor skills. And finally, the world is just no longer the same as it was in 1990, following the fall of the Berlin Wall. We were in a world where the trade was expanding. We had a downward pressure on prices because of what was coming out of China in particular, and we had an expanding global trade order rather than the contracting world trade order, which we now face, and maybe face not just in clubs or diamonds, but in no Trump. Right.
How does the health offer from the federal government yesterday to the provinces affect your deficit? You're thinking about the future of the federal government's fisc. Is that in line with what you were expecting them to offer? Is it more than you were expecting them to offer?
I would say more or less what I was expecting. Yeah, more or less. Yeah. So it adds a bit more pressure. But quite frankly, I mean, there's only one taxpayer, David. And, if we're going to devote more resources, real resources, to the health system, then either that means we're going to devote less resources to other things that governments do, or we as citizens are going to have to pay more in taxes to pay for it. But it's going to take, at least for a period of time, it's going to take more real resources. We're going to need more doctors. We're going to need more medical personnel. We're going to need more old age homes, long-term care. We're going to need a variety of social services associated with an aging population, while at the same time, we're going to have to devote private and public more to providing more capital per worker, so that the smaller fraction of the population that is at work can be more productive. And we're going to have to devote time and effort, both employers, public and private employers, to facilitate the technological upgrading of our labor force. All of that is critical if we're going to, at the very least, maintain our level of per capita income. But we would like to grow it we'd like to grow it at 1% a year if we can.
So if we're thinking about quintessential Canadian imagery, I'm betting the kayak pops into your brain pretty quickly. Kayaks were originally developed by the Inuit, Yupik, and Aleut peoples. Designed for amazing buoyancy and maneuverability, they used them to hunt on lakes, rivers, and the coastal waters of the Arctic Ocean, North Atlantic, Bering Sea, and North Pacific. Today, for most, they're more of a recreational vehicle, eh? I have one myself. Count me as a personal testament to a kayak's buoyancy, Herle Burly-ites. I've been telling stories here the last little while about our presenting sponsor TELUS's cultural commitment to network resilience and reliability. From investing billions of dollars to build differently than their competitors, to their network technicians and field teams pulling out all the stops to keep people connected in the most challenging conditions. In this week's story, the kayak looms large and sleek and narrow. Here's what I mean. The indigenous word Gixin means people of the river mist. In the earliest days of last summer, during a violent storm in the Gixin territory of northwestern BC, a massive tree collapsed and submerged vital TELUS fiber optic cables near the bottom of the Kispiox River, cutting off connectivity to the remote community. 5 TELUS team members, in 2 kayaks and 1 helicopter, were dispatched immediately. Working tirelessly, maneuvering on a strong current from the cockpit of the 2 craft, they were able to haul up and repair the cables, restoring essential power, phone services, and connectivity to the region. For TELUS, resilience and reliability is often about billion-dollar investments in operations and cutting-edge technology. And sometimes it's just about good people and a couple of kayaks. Both are ultimately about how we connect with one another. More next week. I want to get to healthcare, but just one last question on this fiscal situation. You proposed a new fiscal anchor. First of all, you said the government needs a fiscal anchor, and you proposed a new fiscal anchor, which is the amount of government revenue that's being spent on servicing the debt. Is that correct?
Right.
First of all, tell me why you think that's the best anchor.
Well, it's sensitive. It's quite sensitive to what's going on. It's sensitive to changes in interest rates, and it's changes in interest rates that can really kill you if you start with a high level of debt to begin with, right? And so that's why it's important. And given the world that I just outlined, those challenges, that's a world in which upward pressure on prices is going to continue, and so that real interest rates are going to be positive of 1 or 2% a year rather than flat or negative as they have been since the great financial crisis and essentially since the turn of the century.
Right. I guess I'd like to ask you this question, which is when the budget was balanced in the 1990s, you and your associates at the department were always clear that balancing the budget is not really an economic thing. That there are, you're Keynesians. There were some times when you wouldn't want to balance a budget and other times when you ought to be running surpluses. But a balanced budget is a political target more than it is an economic target. My question, I guess, having watched the last number of years, is whether or not it's the only real target that can exist. That because it is clearly understandable by the public and there's no wiggle room on it, that once you move off of balanced budgets as your policy, that it's very easy to get where we've gotten.
That's true, but a balanced budget in any given year may or may not make sense depending on the economic circumstances, right?
I understand that, yeah.
So the real constraints, I say, is whether, as a government, you can continue to borrow to finance things rather than have to raise taxes to finance them. That's the fundamental constraint. And so, you'll remember that's exactly what we hit in 1995, when basically the bond market said we're not going to lend any more money. And so when you can't borrow anymore, either you cut your spending or you raise your taxes. So that's the fundamental constraint. Now, we're a long way at the moment from hitting that constraint. But the first constraint you hit is that you get downgraded, your debt gets downgraded, and you have to pay a greater premium on your interest rates. And so you have then less of every tax dollar left over to actually spend on programs. Now, the federal government at the moment is quite a way away from that, but not all of our provincial governments are. And so that in the end becomes the fundamental constraint. And the last thing one should want to do is to put oneself in the position where the bond market is in charge and the government no longer is in charge itself.
Right. Even socialists like Tommy Douglas used to understand that.
Right.
So let's move to healthcare then, because in 1997, you demoted yourself. You left as DM of the Department of Finance, and you were king of the goddamned hill. And you went to become the Deputy Minister of Health because you were passionate at that point about the need to reform our healthcare system to save it and keep it viable for the long term. So with that in mind, what do you think of yesterday's offer? What do you think of the proposed deal?
I don't think it's a deal at all. The real issue, David, is our delivery system. Number one, can we in fact move forward at the provincial level, province by province, with improving our delivery system to make it more efficient and more effective going forward? Now that is the real challenge. I think undoubtedly we will have to, at least in the short run, we will have to devote a bit higher share of GDP to healthcare than we were used to.
Can I just stop you right there? That shouldn't surprise us, right? I mean, the baby boom bulge has changed our society at every stage of its age. And now that they're all old, it's not surprising that we would be, for a period of 30 years, spending more on healthcare than we normally do, right?
No, that was forecast long ago. David Foote wrote a great book 50 years ago on this.
Yeah.
We've known it. We've known that it's been coming, and we've been unwilling. We've been unwilling since certainly this century. Probably, I would say, unwilling since the late 90s to face up to the fact that we have to prepare for it. Prepare for it in facilities, but also prepare for it in training folks to be able to deliver. At the same time, what has been happening for the last 50 years is technology has been vastly improving people's health generally, so that in fact, we should have been moving the retirement age up year by year, because the expectation of living longer was there. But secondly, it's been dramatically improving the things that healthcare can do for us. And so, we now can fix your knee or fix your hip. And that is resource intensive to do it, although getting less so. We're getting a little bit better at it. But it's usually more resource intensive than 50 years ago, when the only solution was to buy a cane. Right? So healthcare is technological progress in healthcare, which dramatically improves what it can do for us, also dramatically increases the demand for those services, and it increases the demand for those services much faster than it decreases the cost of providing those services. Very different than technology that we're using right now, where the technological improvement does two things. It improves the quality of the service we get, but it dramatically reduces the cost of that service. That is just not the case in healthcare. So yes, we should be expecting that we're going to have to devote a larger fraction of our national income to healthcare certainly for the next 20 years, till we get through, till all of the baby boomers are kaput.
I'll only be 80 then, David. That's when I'm going to get really expensive.
That's right. We know how the expense curve works, and that's just for healthcare. The other parts of it, of course, are the social supports that go along with that. And so, we have to expect that. So we have a question collectively as the Canadian public. Do we want governments to stop doing some other things that they do for us in order to provide the real resources for healthcare? Or do we want to reduce our current private consumption in order to make room for the healthcare, expanded healthcare expenses? But before, that's a fundamental question, and equally fundamental question, or I would say the prior question is, are we making best use of the resources that we currently devote to healthcare? And I spent my time at the Department of Health in Ottawa saying, look, we know the technology in terms of the administration, the running of the system, can do hugely more for us than we're doing. Writing prescriptions by hand and using fax machines to move that around, to not using the full panoply of outpatient services, to making sure that people have regular health checks so that we avoid the expensive part. We've actually moved in the other direction. We kept downgrading the primary care system so that even though we can do a lot more for you when you get sick, we now find people are getting sicker faster or earlier than they should because they haven't had the appropriate primary care along the way.
Right. So Greg Marshallton and Danielle Martin last week told me this on this show, that the fundamental problem in the system was a lack of human capital, a lack of human resources working in the system, and particularly in the primary care area, and that the most important thing was to get people access to primary care. How have we gotten to this place in terms of shortages of healthcare workers?
Well, first of all, our system system is the wrong word. We don't have a system. We have a hodgepodge of mix of right. individual initiatives and silos in the system. So, how have we downgraded? Why have we downgraded primary care? I think in the end, it's because until it gets to a very bad point, which it has now, the acute pain was always felt at the hospital, right? That you couldn't get your hip fixed, or you couldn't get the appropriate cancer care, or that you couldn't get the appropriate emergency care. And the problem was seen as being at the hospital at that point of specialized care. And so when that is what do you think governments do? Well, they react in exactly the way, in a sense, public is telling them to react. And that is whatever additional resources they comes along, you devote to a very specific problem. To have, a network to deal with heart disease, or a network to deal with cancer, or whatever, and the resources then focus on that, forgetting that you've got this underlying base of providing the care, which doesn't seem to be so acute until you get to a point where people just don't have access. They end up at the emergency room, and then the emergency room fails. And it's that failure of the emergency room to be able to deal with it that basically has forced us once again to look at the primary care issue so that's kind of where we are. Now there's some things that we should have done along the way to ease it. I mean, the government keeps talking about data. Well, data is data, blah blah blah, right? But for you and me, it is to have something that you have control, I have control of, that has all of my health record right there, so that not only can I see it, but that if something goes wrong, other people can see it, or that I can take those data and go to someone else and have it looked at. That is the health record issue, if you will. And we've had a problem convincing, I think, the public that is absolutely fundamental to providing better care, because they're afraid that somehow that record is going to leak out and you're going to be compromised. And so that is a problem. That is a very real fear. People somehow felt that if you had a paper record, it didn't leak. Well, of course, that was crazy. Of course, it leaked. But it's a very real fear that people have, and that comes to an issue of being able to have correct personal identifier that works, that is secure, and we've been very reluctant in the health system to let that go, but we don't want it for driver's license or anything else, right? And I think that reluctance to maximize our use of that information about my health and my background, that since we can't use it, then the system is very inefficient in delivering services to me. And so we have to get over that. We started with Health Info Way when I was there in 97. We made inches, right? Rather than yards or miles of getting to where it would mean that our health providers would have that tool which would enable them to deliver to me and you much better health outcomes. To me, that's the one thing. I mean, the Fed shouldn't be talking about this big data business. I mean, that word data somehow loses it, right? You got to bring it back to why it is useful for you and me to have that record system in a way that works for me as a patient, right? That works for me as a patient. And if it does work for me as a patient, inevitably it works tremendously for the provider that has to deal with me as a patient. And so that to me is, and for that is a role that the federal government could play, because the federal government is not delivering the services. The services are being delivered, whether it's doctors or nursing homes or whatever, they're being delivered in a provincial system. But the one thing that would make that whole system work is if we had a Canada-wide secure system where you and I had control of our health records.
Didn't Ontario try to do this about 15 years ago, and it blew up in a spending scandal, and then I haven't heard a word about it since?
Yeah. Well, so there's two problems here. One is the technology, right? And big technology on data. I think today we've got a much better handle on how to do things than we did 30 years ago. But the other issue is the providers themselves, right? They really objected to operating with that data system.
Oh.
Now the providers of 30 years ago are aged and they're now leaving the labor force, and the young providers, whether they're doctors, nurses, or whomever, are much more ready and able to use it. So I don't think we have the provider resistance that we had before, but we still have the public resistance, this fear that somebody's going to grab that data and use it against me. So, but that would be the one thing, if we could move on that, if the feds could provide that security. And it's a big if it's not. I'm not saying that it's totally easy, but I think if that's where the effort got put, right, that takes away not at all the provincial responsibility for the actual delivery of care, but it facilitates the healthcare providers in a way that the best way that I can think of to actually improve the efficiency of the system and thereby lower cost, better results at lower cost.
I want to talk for a moment about government regulation, something we have a fair amount of in Canada. It's complicated. There's general agreement that government should not try to oversee and manage the economy, but there's also a natural urge to demand that government step in when problems hit home. Supply chains are a good example. Our sponsor, CN, is perhaps the most vital link in Canada's supply chains, because just about everything moves by train. And supply chains have been gummed up worldwide for years now. War and the pandemic and changing weather have caused disruptions, which have caused shortages, which have in turn caused inflation and even higher interest rates. It's affected just about everybody. Inevitably, there have been suggestions that the solution lies with more government and more regulation. Expanding the power of agencies to intervene, for example, and to exert more control over supply chain participants, to perhaps oblige railways to accept and manage more of each other's cargo, trading it back and forth across the country, or forcing transportation companies to prioritize one industry's products over another. CN would respectfully suggest that our supply chain participants know their jobs better than anyone, and that more regulation would more than likely increase costs, dampen investment, and dilute service. And it says that as a railway that has moved record amounts of grain out of the prairies to domestic and foreign markets in recent months. The fact is, every link in the supply chain is at the mercy of all the other links: manufacturers, railways, shippers, truckers, ocean-going ships, and government terminals, to name several. And the only way our domestic supply chains will operate at maximum capacity is for all the players to coordinate transparently, collaboratively, and constantly. CN pledges to do just that. It is utterly committed to moving cargo and delivering it on time.
Okay, I got one last question on healthcare, and you've over the years been a teller of uncomfortable truths to me, and I'm a bleeding heart liberal, so you know where I'll be coming from on this, but I have to ask you, do you think that an expansion of for-profit healthcare delivery is something that will help our system?
I'm not going to answer that directly. What I am going to answer in this way. I think it's absolutely true that specialized clinics outside of the general hospital will dramatically improve our ability to deliver all sorts of specialized care. There's no reason that most people need to go to the hospital to have a knee replacement or hip replacement. No reason to have a cataract operation in the hospital. And all sorts of special surgery can well be done in a specialized clinic. I mean, after all, in Ontario, we've had the Shouldice Clinic to deal with hernia for years, right? So I think the idea, the root issue here is to develop the system of specialized clinics with people that are able to deliver those services really much more efficiently than we can do it in the general hospital. Now, those clinics can be privately operated, and then you have incentives if they are privately operated to deliver those clinical services in the most efficient way. But private operation, it can be totally consistent and is totally consistent with a publicly paid for system. It's just a question of who runs the operation. I mean, after all, David, we used to have family docs that were little businesses. That's what a family doc was. And what
they ran a little clinic. There were 2 or 3 doctors grouped together, and they'd have a clinic.
And
right?
Exactly.
But that's different than what I'm thinking about. I mean, when corporations come in here and with the demands that their investors have on returns, like if Shoppers Drug Mart or even our sponsor TELUS gets into healthcare, the kind of returns that they're going to be looking for don't seem to me to be possible through just getting paid by OHIP or whatever your provincial agency is. You're going to be looking for private sources of money. And everybody tells me Shouldice does that. Shouldice makes you stay in the hospital for 3 days, whereas in the public system, you're out the same day from a hernia operation. And you pay for those days in their clinic. They are extracting additional rent from just what OHIP is paying for them in order to keep going. That's a 2-tier system, isn't it, David?
I think that's right. And if you want luxury service, right? You pay for it. You can pay for it, and that is not unreasonable, right? Everywhere else in the world that runs public health system, and very efficiently in Europe, for example, France, have that tier where you can pay for it. Our problem in this country, let's face what our problem is. We have 2 tiers, and we have 2 very dramatic tiers, but they're not separated horizontally; they're separated vertically. So we have the so-called publicly insured system for hospitals and docs, and then if you want your eyes fixed, if you want your ears fixed, if you want your teeth fixed, if you want physio help, and if you want drugs, unless you're 65 and over, you go over to the other side, which is private insurance or private out of pocket. And so our system is roughly 70%, the big public hospitals and docs, and 30% all the other health services, which we pay for privately, or you have employer insurance, or you don't get, which is
right.
Is very often the case. So I think it's people don't understand.
But Greg Marshall said to me that the core principle of our system is that the next procedure goes to the person who needs it the most.
If you're in the hospital and doc side,
yeah,
right. If your eyes are failing, if your teeth are broken, or if you need physio services, it goes only to the person that can pay the most. So it depends what part of the system you're looking at, and if you're talking about drugs for the non-covered people, at elderly folks, which we do cover, but for then we rely on employers to provide that support. So we have a very bizarre system. There's nowhere in the world that would divide its system in the way we do, and it happened that way for historical reasons. So, you're talking to Greg. I mean, that Saskatchewan experience of many years ago has colored our whole approach in Canada, and we never did move away from insurance. And so we still operate with an insurance system, which was not the original intent that Tommy Douglas had in Saskatchewan. But as a result of the doctors' strike, we ended where we are, and we have continued to march along that path. Now, as one looks at the NHS, it was the sort of Tommy Douglas's model, if you will. Look at the NHS today, you'd say, oh my goodness, well, maybe that hasn't been so great either. But the NHS has done exactly what we were talking about earlier, that they have been unwilling to provide the increase in real resources to that system as the British population aged. Right? So, I think systemically the NHS system is very good, but if you want to go to a European system, which I think is the only direction that we can go, then you certainly do have to have a tier on those, let me call them semi-elective, for semi-elective services that people pay for themselves. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, provided the basic service is accessible. And the first basic service to be accessible is the family health team. Right. And that is not where we are. So if you look at where you want to start at the moment in throwing, in building additional resources, you got to get them in there, because that will help the problems we end with at the emergency room, and so on. But in terms of terms of clinics, I think the use of clinics outside of the general hospital turns out to be a very, very sensible way to go. The end, though, I'll just make one last point. There's always an issue then, is who is in control there? Is it that the primary care system then contracts the specialized care, which is basically the model that the Brits have tried, that the basic responsibility is with the primary care provider, and when they can't provide that care, then they go to the specialist outside, whether it's at the hospital. That would be a big change for our system, right? That it makes a lot of sense, but I think that it is a very big change. We've tried local authorities. The one I'm really familiar with, the Capital Health Group in Edmonton, tried to operate that way, and I think did an extraordinarily good job. And to me, that was a good example of something that worked, whereas the Calgary one did not work, where Foothills, the hospital, was in charge. On the other hand, the Alberta government decided to scrap it all and bring it all together. So these are not easy, and I don't think the feds can dictate which way a province is going to organize that. But the thing we can do at the federal level is to help providing that information system on which everything really rests. And if it doesn't work well, then the service providers can't be very efficient, and you, as a citizen, cannot get the best health care.
Cool. Thank you for that. Very interesting. I want to switch gears now because in addition to your fiscal paper, you, through your law firm Bennett Jones, you and our old friend Serge Dupont co-authored a veritable tour de horizon of the Canadian and global economies. A section of this paper jumped out at me. A critical bottom line for Canada is as true today as it was 1 year ago or before COVID. In fact, it is even more compelling. Investment in new, sustainable, productive capacity must ramp up sharply, driven by a sense of urgency. Private and public investment in physical capital, but also in innovation, intangible capital, and human capital hold the key to transforming the economy in response to climate change, the digital revolution, and population aging. Can you repeat that in English?
Yeah. Governments are going to invest more, and in particular, businesses have to invest more. Basically, productivity of you or me at the workbench, whatever the nature of the workbench you have, depends on the amount of capital you've got to work with, whether it's the physical capital or whether it's the intellectual or digital capital that goes with it. And if we're going to get our productivity up, given we have a shrinking fraction of the population in the labor force, then in order to do that, we're going to have to provide the individual worker, whether they're in the private sector, whether it's a private employer, whether it's a public employer, going to have to provide them with the capital that makes their hour of work turn out more goods or more services than they have been, right? And if you look at our history in this country, we have since the great financial crisis in particular, but throughout this century, we have in fact not been increasing the ratio of physical or intellectual capital per worker over time. And so not surprisingly, the rate of growth of output per worker has been low, much lower than historically, if we go back to the last quarter of the last century, and low relative to what other OECD countries are doing. And therefore, what we really need is that for business to reinvest more of their retained earnings year by year to raise the productivity of their workers, rather than turn to governments and say, oh, my goodness, I can't find enough workers. Could you please let me import somebody from abroad? Because I can't find enough workers, and I'm not willing to invest enough to raise the productivity of those individual workers. So then we end kind of with a stalemate. You don't get increased output because we haven't got enough labor force, and you don't get increased output because you're unwilling to reinvest enough of your operating surplus to increase the productivity, so you don't need as many new workers. So that is the fundamental problem we face, just, if you will, the ongoing problem. Add to that the need to deal with climate change, which means we have to change the way we produce energy and how we use energy, right?
And distribute it. And distribute it.
And distribute it, absolutely. And so that means that at least in the short run, a higher fraction of earnings have got to go into investment, rebuilding the new system, whether it's a new electrical system or whatever, or whether it's carbon capture and storage, so that we can continue to capitalize on our abundant supplies of oil and gas. All of that comes together, and so that raises two issues for public policy. One is that for the private sector to be productive, they need complementary public capital to go along with it, whether it's transportation systems or whether it's a public regulatory system that facilitates that new investment. Right? The public sector and the private sector have to complement each other in the investments they make, and you can't expect the private sector to take risk. There's a lot of risk in some of this investment. Take it if, in fact, the public sector isn't doing its best bit, either through investment in the physical capital or by providing complementary regulatory and complementary investment, co-investment, if you will, in some of these very risky areas. So that, and all of that means we've got to increase our share of investment, which has fallen to under 14% of GDP from historic levels of about 15.5. But given what we've got to do on the energy side or on the climate change side, because it's not all just energy. It means you're going to have to locate your businesses in different places. You can't build in a floodplain and all that sort of stuff, right?
But I swear to God, you explained this all to me 30 years ago in a CMO. Like, this is not a new problem, is it? This is a long problem for Canada. And in fact, I don't want to misquote him, but I think a few years ago, Don Drummond told me that he'd sort of lost hope in private sector investment in this country because he thought that so much had been done at the policy level to try to encourage it and try to drive it, and it just doesn't happen.
Well, let me just, I don't think that's quite right. I think there are some things that we've done at the policy level that are positively discouraging. Right? I mean, given our complicated system of getting anything improved, whether it's building a house, whether it's building a pipeline, whether it's building a railway, whether it's putting down a new road, whatever, we made it so complicated and so risky. The system of approval becoming so risky that you say, look, I'm willing to take care as an investor. I'm willing to take the economic risk. I can make judgment, but I can't go ahead and do things if I can't be sure what the government rules are not only are, but are going to be as I work my way through the project. So I would say that this century, for sure, I would argue that we have had a regulatory rules-making system which is decidedly unfriendly to investment because it in itself becomes the major risk. And that's very different from earlier periods. In particular, if I go back to the 50s and 60s and 70s, if I go back to those periods where the emphasis was on economic growth and clearing the route to get things done. That was the great pipeline debate, right? This was a debate where the liberals wanted to clear the way to get things done, and were criticized for so doing, right? But growth and what you need to do to facilitate that growth is kind of fell off the table. And we thought that all of what governments could do required spending. Well, that's not true. What governments could do is to provide the assurance that people can come ahead and take the risk. And it's not just government. I don't think our courts have been very helpful in that regard either. So it's not just government. And then finally, and this may be more what Don was referring to, or what Peter Nicholson has argued for a long time, that it is easy in some areas to make a lot of money in Canada without having to be terribly aggressive, innovative in order to do it. And so that in those areas, we've not been as innovative, not because our people are stupid. In fact, because business is smart to understand that they don't have to make some of those investments, and they can distribute the profits that are coming from that. And that would, I think Peter Nicholson's written a lot about that. And if you look back historically, there's a lot to be said that is it. And that for whatever reason, and I think maybe it's simply our physical history in the country and our spread outness, we don't seem to have had the companies that have had the desire to be number one in the world and to take over the world, but rather to distribute their income quickly and to sell out before becoming number one, and or even when they were number one, to let it go by not reinvesting. So, I think there's a lot of that, but to say that governments have done a lot to help private investment, I think ignores the fact that we've created a lot of barriers in our regulatory system.
Thanks. I'm starting to impose on your time, but I have a relatively long question about immigration for you. You up for it?
I'll try.
So, your paper that you did with Serge talks about labor shortages and seems to talk approvingly of the federal government's plan to expand the workforce. Not a solution, but a part of a solution. The Trudeau government got elected on a premise that the middle class had not had a raise in 30 years, and that income growth for most Canadians was stalled. Now we have an imbalance in favor of labor and an opportunity for labor to bid up its price and get a bigger share of the pie.
So the government floods the country with new workers. Isn't that putting the thumb on the scale in favor of business and against workers in Canada?
Well, you used a very emotive word, flood. Right?
Well, I mean, if you add temporary foreign workers to the immigration targets, it's 1 million people a year.
Yeah. So there's a balance here which makes sense. And there, I think the balance is that given the particular circumstance we're in of this big cohort moving out of the that increasing for a period of time, increasing the number of workers coming in that will help to replace at least some of those that are moving out. So I think there is an argument that can be made at this point in time for a level of skilled immigration, i.e. labor force ready immigration, that is higher than we might have had 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, just for that one reason. That doesn't say that you want to have enough people come to replace at the unskilled level or semi-skilled level. That is where you would really like wages to rise, rather than wages to rise to force employers of those sorts of folks to invest in new technology that didn't require as much labor to produce those goods or those services, right? And historically, again, if you go back to Walter Reuther and the auto workers, Walter Reuther always argued that the only way we're going to increase productivity, and it's the way for autos, and the only way we're going to improve productivity in the mines is to raise the price of labor so much that they have to figure out different ways to produce the stuff. And make it more efficient. So I think there's a real balance there, absolutely. And so we have done two things. First of all, we've got this program basically to support our universities by charging outrageous fees to foreign students, which is it's not a terrible program, but the reason that the students come here is not because we offer superior education. It's because this is a route to get landed status at some point, right? And I would argue that we've gone far too far. Having some foreign students is really good because it increases the diversity. But when foreign students dominate the classroom, that's not a very good idea. So I think we've gone far too far in that direction, and I would argue we should finance our universities appropriately for the Canadian students that are there, and not have to get some economic rent out of the foreign students. And we can get it because of this immigration path. So there's a problem there. On the numbers, I would say our numbers are too high for the next few years. That's not to say we shouldn't be higher than we were over the decade. The first 2 decades of this century probably should be a bit higher, but I mean we've got really big numbers. And then the final issue is that you can't look at it only from the labor supply side. You have to look at it from the demand side as well. And here we are in a situation where we have not enough housing. We have not enough housing for our relatively low natural growth of the population, and so we are adding large numbers of people, especially in the major urban areas, driving up the prices of housing, hence driving up the nominal wage that people need to have in order to have the same income as they used to have, because we've driven up rents and we've driven up housing prices by needing an extra roughly 100,000 units of housing units a year because of our immigration program. And so that, in the end, turns out to be defeating. And it drives up the demands on our health system as well. And so you've got to consider all these factors and put them all together. I would say we're way too high in the aggregate in terms of the number of people. And then finally, I mean, there is a real issue on the refugee side. There always has been a real issue on the refugee side, because in the end, all the settlement services fall back in the end largely on the municipalities, and that I think creates problems in and of itself. So I think you should not have taken from our paper that we think 500,000 immigrants a year is necessarily the solution. Some is to help offset some definite skill problems. Yeah. But employers that have really shitty working conditions, to put it bluntly, and don't pay very good wages, we shouldn't accommodate their desires through our immigration system.
Right. When people say Canadians won't do this work, maybe it's just that Canadians won't do it at those prices.
Or those working conditions.
Right, or those working conditions.
Those working conditions. Yeah. And the other side of that one, David, which we do talk about, is really how do we make the workplace more friendly, if you will, for older workers, to allow them to continue to make a contribution as they get older. And that requires employers to think through the way that they are doing things. And some employers, rely on those older workers. I mean, thank goodness you have the Home Depots of the world that can provide you and me excellent service, because they pick up the former plumbers and carpenters that know what they're doing and can help you go. So, there's those sorts of things. And then secondly,
this has got to be a white collar, blue collar distinction, though. I've always thought about that on the raising of the retirement age, because I don't know any of my friends who are consultants or lawyers or whatever. None of them want to retire when they're 65. None of them are even considering retiring when they're 65. Right. But I bet if you're a construction worker, you're anxious to retire by the time you're 65.
If you're a block layer, you want to retire at 50, so you still have a back.
Yeah.
Right? Absolutely. but those individuals have skills that can be used. Maybe not laying blocks or maybe not laying tiles, but have skills that can be used, and certainly can be used in terms of passing on and training younger workers that have, for at least for a while, have stronger backs to be able to do the job. But that requires a lot of thought process in thinking through, which is possible for large organizations to organize that way. It's hard for small business to retain, that very expert tile setter or whatever on just as a, if you will, coach and help for the younger folks. Big business can do that. Very hard for small business.
Right. Okay. I'm really taking up your time, but I got one more question for you. And this is on the public service. Okay. The people you had gathered around you at finance in the 1990s, you and Scott and Susan Peterson and Don Drummond and Jim Judd, and I could go on and on, Ian Bennett. That group of people is the most talented group of people I have worked with in my life, in any endeavor. Public sector, private sector, never found a business with smarter people than that sitting around thinking about what to do. But now people talk about the inability of the public service to deliver, the lack of policy capacity inside the public service, and now we see that the government's outsourcing advice and planning to management consulting firms. What's happened to the federal public service? Anything?
David, it's a long time. Remember, I left the public service, almost a quarter century ago. So it's hard for me. I would say though that there are a number of things. Our mantra, you will remember very well, was under promise and over deliver. Right. And we spent a lot of time before putting a policy into effect trying to figure out how that would actually work on the ground, and actually do what we thought it should do, whether that was in terms of a tax regime or whether that was in terms of a social policy or whatever. We spent a lot of time on the practicalities of that, and didn't promise to do something that we at least had a reasonable concept of how it would be delivered by national revenue or by employment and immigration or whomever. And we were lucky at that time that we didn't have the 24-hour news cycle. We didn't have everybody on Twitter and so on. And so we actually had some time to think about it and to try to at least have a pretty good idea of how it would actually be done. I think the pressure of the 24-hour news cycle, of the Twitterverse and so on, makes it very much harder both to put together policies and certainly very much harder to take the time before you say you want to do something to figure out how you would actually do it, how you would actually deliver it. So I think it's much harder today for ministers and for public service to do their job right than it was 30 or 40 years ago. I think that one of the bad effects of social media it has been to so shorten the timeline to deal with things that inevitably you're going to make mistakes, and inevitably people, the citizens, quite rightly, will be pissed off at government and feel that they don't know what they're doing. So I don't think it's because intellectually public service today is weaker than it was before. It may be a little, because it's very discouraging if you're trying to deal with a problem to, in essence, not being given the opportunity to deal with, because you have to deliver something tomorrow. So I think that is just a reality of government, whether it's federal or provincial or local, same sort of issue. So I'm loath to be critical of the folks that are there now. I just think that the environment in which they're working is much harder. But, we were talking about health earlier, and we were talking about immigration. So let me use those two things as an example. So immigration, all of a sudden, the government gets this idea that really a huge increase is really good. We should do that. And they announce it, right? Well, that's terrific, except, we have an old-fashioned way of how we deal with security for people coming in. We have all those things. And so if you're going to double the number of visas you want to issue, and if you want to issue them in places that are non-traditional, let me put it that way, or even where they're traditional and that they're huge problems, then you've got to be prepared. Well, so we announce all this stuff, and then lo and behold, we can't deal with it. And so the government really looks bad because they've forgotten the line that you want to over-deliver on whatever promises you make, or you better under-promise to start with. And in a very real sense, it's exactly the same thing we have on the health side, that we've raised the expectation of what we can deliver, and we have no capacity. We've no capacity to actually deliver it. So I think that's where we are, and so I'm loath to be. I'm not loath to criticize the fact that the performance of the public sector has been poorer than it was 30 or 40 years ago. But I'm loath to criticize the people, because I think they are operating under much more difficult conditions than we operated under back in the dark ages, David.
David, every second of this conversation has been fascinating and insightful. I can't thank you enough for doing this. I need to thank my presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN. I want to thank everybody who listens or watches to this podcast. But by God, David Dodge, thank you for giving me an hour and a half today. Fantastic.
My pleasure, David. You take care. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.
Burly, burly. Burly, burly.